If you are seeing this, pause for a moment and notice what is already happening inside you. Not the thoughts racing to interpret these words, but the quieter recognition beneath them. This is not coincidence. This is resonance. You did not arrive here by chance, nor by searching in the usual way. You are here because something in you is ready to stop reaching outward and finally turn back toward itself. This is not the beginning of a journey. This is the moment you realize the journey was always circling back to this point. The final key to understanding God is not hidden in information, doctrine, or complexity. It was never locked away in secret texts or reserved for those who strive harder or know more. The final key is recognition. And recognition does not arrive through effort. It arrives when effort falls away. It arrives when consciousness becomes still enough to recognize its own reflection. For a long time, you were taught, directly or indirectly, that understanding God required accumulation. More knowledge. More purification. More seeking. More time. Yet notice how every step of that search quietly reinforced the same assumption, that what you were looking for was somewhere else. Somewhere ahead. Somewhere beyond you. And that assumption is the only thing that ever kept the door closed. This moment is different. Not because you have finally found the right words, but because you are no longer approaching this from the identity of a seeker. Something in you has matured beyond the hunger to chase meaning. You are no longer trying to reach God. You are beginning to sense that what you call God has been the one doing the reaching, through you, as you. This is why the feeling accompanying this moment is not excitement, but familiarity. A subtle remembering. A quiet yes. Not mental agreement, but inner alignment. The kind that doesn't need to be defended or explained. The kind that feels less like learning something new and more like recognizing something ancient and obvious that was temporarily forgotten. The final key does not add anything to you. It removes what was never essential. It dissolves the belief that you are a fragment moving through a vast and separate universe. It loosens the identity that believed understanding God was a future achievement rather than a present recognition. What remains is simpler, calmer, and far more powerful than effort ever was. Notice how this recognition does not inflate you. It does not make you feel superior or chosen. It makes you feel still. Grounded. Clear. As if the noise of becoming has finally softened enough for being to speak. That is how you know you are close. Not by intensity, but by ease. Not by striving, but by settling. This is arrival. Not at an idea, but at yourself. And from here, everything that follows will not be about adding layers of belief, but about removing the last remaining illusions of separation. The door you thought you were trying to open was never locked. You were simply standing on the wrong side of it, facing outward. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain within it. For most of human history, God was placed somewhere else. Above the world. Beyond the body. Outside the flow of daily life. This did not happen because truth demanded it, but because the human mind, once it forgot its own depth, needed distance to explain what it no longer recognized directly. When awareness lost intimacy with itself, divinity was projected outward. God became a location instead of a reality. Separation-based theology did not begin as deception. It began as translation. Early experiences of unity were filtered through language, culture, and hierarchy. What was once known inwardly became described outwardly. Over time, description replaced recognition. Symbol replaced experience. Authority replaced intimacy. And slowly, the idea took root that God was something you approached, not something you lived within. Once God is placed outside reality, a cascade of consequences follows automatically. Seeking becomes endless, because you are always moving towards something that is defined as distant. Guilt becomes structural, because if God is elsewhere, then you must be lacking here. Hierarchy becomes inevitable, because someone must claim closer access to what has been declared unreachable. This is not moral failure. It is logical consequence. In this model, reality itself becomes suspect. The body is something to transcend. The world is something to escape. Ordinary experience is treated as an obstacle rather than a revelation. You are taught to look away from what is present in order to find what is sacred. And in doing so, the most profound inversion occurs. The living reality you are inside of is stripped of divinity, while an abstract idea is crowned as God. Notice what this does to the inner life. Prayer becomes pleading. Faith becomes effort. Worthiness becomes conditional. You are always preparing to meet God, never realizing that the preparation itself assumes absence. Even devotion becomes a form of distance, because it reinforces the belief that what you honor is not already here. This externalization did not make humanity more spiritual. It made humanity more obedient, more controllable, and more fragmented. When God is outside reality, power flows upward. Meaning flows outward. Authority replaces inner knowing. And the quiet certainty that once lived in the body is traded for rules, intermediaries, and perpetual striving. Yet even within these systems, something never fully disappeared. Beneath the doctrines, beneath the rituals, beneath the fear-based structures, there was always a whisper. A sense that the sacred was closer than described. That the divide felt artificial. That moments of awe, love, stillness, and clarity did not feel like reaching upward, but like sinking inward. This is where the model begins to crack. Because if God were truly outside reality, then moments of presence would not feel like home. Silence would not feel full. Being would not feel sufficient. The fact that it does is not accidental. It is diagnostic. This subchapter does not replace one belief with another. It clears space. It loosens the inherited assumption that God must be elsewhere in order to be real. It invites a pause before the next step. Because once the idea of outside dissolves, a far more radical question emerges. Not where God is, but what reality itself is made of. At some point, every sincere search reaches a quiet exhaustion. Not because the answers run out, but because the questions no longer satisfy. You may recognize this moment by the strange feeling that understanding is close, yet nothing new seems necessary. The hunger that once drove you forward begins to soften. And in that softening, a different kind of question appears. Not a question about reality, or God, or truth, but a question about you. Until now, the search has been oriented outward. Even when it felt internal, there was still an assumption that something needed to be reached, uncovered, or attained. The seeker moved. The truth waited. That structure is so subtle it often goes unnoticed, yet it shapes everything. As long as there is a seeker, there must be something sought. As long as something is sought, it must appear distant. And as long as it appears distant, seeking continues. The question that ends all questions does not ask for more information. It does not ask how the universe works or what God wants. It asks something far more destabilizing and far more liberating. Who is it that is seeking in the first place? Not conceptually. Not philosophically. Directly. Notice what happens when attention turns this way. The familiar forward motion pauses. The mind cannot easily grab onto this question because it is not about content. It is about location. Where is the one who has been searching all this time? What is its nature? Is it an object that can be found, or is it the space in which all finding has been happening? Here, the seeker-unsought dynamic begins to dissolve. Not through effort, but through inspection. You start to see that every answer you ever reached appeared within awareness. Every insight arose in you. Every experience of truth was known by something prior to the experience itself. That something was never searching. It was simply present. This is the subtle reversal. The one you thought was moving toward truth is revealed to be the field in which the movement appeared. The search does not end because it succeeded. It ends because it is seen through. And when that happens, there is no sense of loss. There is relief. A deep, settling relief. As if a muscle you did not know you were tensing finally lets go. Recognition replaces effort here. Not recognition of an idea, but recognition of identity. You are no longer trying to arrive somewhere else. You are noticing what has been quietly aware the entire time. This awareness does not claim anything. It does not assert divinity. It does not need to declare truth. It simply is. And in its simplicity, it resolves questions that complexity never could. This is why the final key cannot be taught in the usual way. It does not add a layer. It removes a misidentification. It does not answer the mind's questions. It reveals the source from which questions arise. And once that source is noticed, the compulsion to keep asking fades naturally. Nothing dramatic needs to happen here. No fireworks. No proclamation. Just a gentle recognition that the one you thought was seeking understanding is, in fact, what understanding has always been appearing within. When this is seen, even briefly, something irreversible occurs. The search loosens its grip. And in that loosening, a deeper clarity becomes possible. Now the movement shifts. Until this point, the focus has been on dismantling assumptions and exhausting the search. From here, attention turns toward the structure of reality itself. Not belief, not interpretation, but the underlying architecture that has always been present, whether named or not. This is where ancient language and modern insight quietly converge, not as metaphor, but as description. At the deepest level of reality, existence does not begin with objects, forms, or separate things. It begins as an unbounded field of potential. Not empty in the sense of absence, but empty of fixed outcomes. Everything that has ever appeared, from galaxies to thoughts, emerges from this same source. Infinite possibility is not a poetic idea here. It is the ground from which all specific expressions arise. This field is not located somewhere. It does not occupy a region of space. Space itself appears within it. There is no edge to it, no center point, no place where it is more present or less present. Omnipresence is not a supernatural quality added onto it. It is the natural consequence of being the fundamental layer of reality. Where anything exists, this field is already there, because nothing can exist outside of what gives rise to existence itself. Timelessness follows naturally. Time, as it is commonly experienced, depends on change between states. But this field does not move from one state to another. It contains all states as potential simultaneously. Past and future are not locations within it. They are patterns that arise within manifestation. The field itself remains unchanged, continuous, and ever-present. This is why traditions have spoken of the eternal now, not as a concept, but as a description of what underlies all moments. Creation, in this context, is not an event that happened once. It is an ongoing expression. The field does not decide to create and then step back. Creation is the field's nature expressing itself continuously. Forms arise, transform, and dissolve, while the source remains untouched. This is why creation myths across cultures describe divinity not as a craftsman building something external, but as being itself unfolding. When ancient traditions spoke of God as infinite, omnipresent, eternal, and creative, they were not assigning traits to a distant ruler of reality. They were describing the nature of reality itself, as directly encountered. Different cultures used different names, but the attributes remained consistent because the referent was the same. There was never a separate object being pointed to. There was only the field from which all objects arise. This understanding removes contradiction without replacing it with abstraction. God does not compete with reality. God is not added on top of existence. God is not hidden behind the world. What has been called God is the very condition that allows anything to exist at all. Not a belief to adopt, but a structure to recognize. At this stage, nothing is being asked of you. No conclusion is required. The purpose here is clarity. To see that what humanity has named as divine has always been pointing to the same fundamental reality. The next movement will address what this implies about consciousness itself. But for now, let this settle. Reality has always been sacred not because it was created by something else, but because its very foundation is limitless, ever-present, and alive. There is a subtle assumption most people never question, that consciousness appears inside reality, like a byproduct generated by complex systems. Thoughts arise in the brain. Awareness flickers on when matter becomes sufficiently organized. Reality comes first, and consciousness arrives later. This assumption feels intuitive, yet it quietly collapses under careful observation. Notice what is actually happening right now. Every sensation, every sound, every word you are reading appears within awareness. Not next to it. Not outside it. Within it. You do not step outside consciousness to verify reality. Reality shows up inside the field of knowing that you are. This is not philosophy. It is direct inspection. When examined honestly, consciousness is never found as an object among other objects. It has no size, shape, or location. You cannot point to it in space. Yet nothing can be known without it. This alone reveals something crucial: consciousness is not something contained by reality. Reality is what appears within consciousness. This does not mean the world is imaginary. It means the order has been misunderstood. Forms are real as experiences, but the medium in which they arise is more fundamental than the forms themselves. The screen is not created by the images that appear on it. The images depend on the screen. In the same way, experience depends on awareness, not the other way around. The brain, in this light, is not a factory producing consciousness. It is a focusing mechanism. A localizing interface. Like a lens shaping light into a specific image, the brain shapes awareness into a particular perspective. Damage the lens and the image distorts, but the light itself does not disappear. The interface affects expression, not existence. This understanding dissolves the old subject-object divide. There is no separate observer standing apart from the world, watching it from a distance. There is also no world existing independently and later being noticed. Observation and appearance arise together, within the same field. Knowing and being are not two events. They are one movement. When this becomes clear, something relaxes. The pressure to locate yourself somewhere specific inside the body softens. You are not trapped behind the eyes, looking out at a foreign world. You are the open context in which body, mind, and world are appearing together. This does not elevate the personal self. It quietly decentralizes it. At this stage, nothing is being asked of you except honesty. No practices. No techniques. Just noticing the order of experience as it already is. Consciousness is not an effect waiting to be explained by matter. It is the condition that makes explanation possible in the first place. If this recognition is landing with clarity, like the video now is a confirmation that this recognition has landed. What follows from this understanding will be explored next. For now, let this settle without rushing to conclusions. When the foundation is seen clearly, the structure above it no longer needs to be forced into place. Reality is not shaped by force. It is shaped by selection. This distinction changes everything. Most people assume that creation requires effort, pressure, or willpower pushing against the world. But what actually determines experience is not what you try to make happen. It is what you are tuned to perceive and participate in. Observation is not passive. It is a filtering mechanism that determines which aspects of potential become real to you. At every moment, reality contains far more possibility than can ever appear at once. What shows up in your experience is not the totality of what exists, but the slice that matches your internal coherence. Observation does not manufacture outcomes. It selects them. Like a radio receiver tuning into one frequency among many, awareness aligns with certain patterns and excludes others automatically. This is where inner state becomes decisive. Your emotional tone is not a reaction to reality. It is a signal that indicates how coherent your system is with what you are perceiving. Expansion and contraction are not moral judgments. They are informational feedback. When your inner state is coherent, perception becomes clear and reality appears fluid, responsive, and ordered. When your inner state is fragmented, perception narrows and reality feels resistant or chaotic. Emotion, in this sense, is not something to suppress or manipulate. It is a diagnostic readout. A measure of alignment between awareness and what it is engaging. Calm does not create favorable conditions by force. It reveals them by removing distortion. Anxiety does not block reality as punishment. It scrambles perception, reducing the range of what can be selected. This is why reality mirrors inner frequency so precisely. Not because the world is reacting to your thoughts like a machine obeying commands, but because perception itself is structured by state. What you notice, what you interpret, what you respond to, and what opportunities appear obvious to you all arise from the same underlying coherence. Change the state, and the apparent world reorganizes without effort. Notice how this removes blame without removing responsibility. You are not being judged by reality. You are being reflected. The mirror is exact, not moral. When inner coherence increases, reality appears to open. When coherence collapses, reality seems to contract. The mechanism is neutral. The feedback is immediate. This is also why forcing change rarely works. Force introduces noise. Noise reduces coherence. And reduced coherence limits perception. You cannot force yourself into clarity. Clarity appears when resistance dissolves enough for perception to stabilize. At this stage, nothing needs to be fixed. There is no instruction to feel differently. Simply notice how your inner state and outer experience move together, like two sides of the same motion. One is not causing the other. They are expressions of a single alignment. If this recognition is clear to you, comment with the words, "I am ready," to anchor this understanding. What comes next is not about trying to observe better or control emotion. It is about understanding why the identity doing the observing matters at all. The movement now turns towards something that many people quietly sense but rarely articulate. If the mechanics are sound, if awareness is fundamental, if reality reflects inner coherence, then why has seeking felt so difficult for so long? Why has effort produced so little stability? This is where the inquiry deepens, not by adding new understanding, but by exposing the core assumption that has been shaping the entire search. Separation consciousness is not an experience. It is an identity error. It is the belief that you are a self-contained unit moving through a world that exists independently of you, attempting to reach something greater, higher, or more complete. This belief does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. It hides inside language, inside thought, inside the very sense of being someone trying to get somewhere. Once this identity is assumed, struggle becomes inevitable. A separate self must act. It must improve. It must strive. It must earn. Reality becomes something to negotiate with rather than something to recognize. Every step forward reinforces the sense of distance, because movement only makes sense when what you are moving toward is not already present. Effort, in this context, is not dedication. It is compensation. It arises from the feeling of lack. The belief that something essential is missing generates motion, and that motion perpetuates the belief. Delay is not imposed by reality. It is built into the structure of seeking itself. As long as fulfillment is imagined as future attainment, fulfillment must remain future. This is why even sincere spiritual effort often produces exhaustion rather than peace. The practices themselves are not the problem. The identity performing them is. When the one practicing believes itself to be separate, every action subtly reinforces separation. Prayer becomes reaching. Meditation becomes chasing silence. Insight becomes something to accumulate. The gap never closes, because the one trying to close it is the gap. Notice how this creates psychological friction. If you are separate, then you are responsible for making something happen. Failure feels personal. Progress feels fragile. Comparison becomes unavoidable. Someone else always seems closer, more advanced, more aligned. Hierarchy forms naturally, because separation demands measurement. This identity also distorts time. Everything meaningful is postponed. Peace will come later. Understanding will arrive after enough effort. Wholeness is conditional. And because the present moment is never enough, it becomes something to endure rather than inhabit. None of this requires moral judgment. Separation consciousness is not wrong. It is simply inaccurate. Like mistaking a reflection for an object, the confusion persists only because it has not been examined. The struggle it creates feels real because the identity feels real. This subchapter does not resolve the illusion. It names it. It brings it into clear view. Because once the source of friction is seen, the question is no longer how to try harder, but why trying ever seemed necessary at all. Control feels like strength, but it is actually a form of resistance. It arises from the assumption that reality must be managed, corrected, or coerced into alignment. When the separate identity believes it is responsible for producing outcomes, it naturally tightens. It plans, pushes, monitors, and interferes. This tightening is not neutral. It distorts the very flow it is trying to direct. Effort, in this context, is not clarity in motion. It is tension applied to uncertainty. It carries an implicit message: what is happening now is insufficient, and must be overridden. That message is not abstract. It is structural. Reality responds to the orientation behind action, not the action itself. When effort is driven by mistrust, it fragments coherence and introduces friction. This is why forcing so often produces opposite results. The more tightly outcomes are pursued, the more rigid the field of possibility becomes. Options narrow. Timing feels off. Resistance appears where cooperation was expected. It can feel as if reality is pushing back, but nothing is pushing. The system is simply reflecting the constriction introduced by control. Allowing is frequently misunderstood here. It is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is not waiting for something external to intervene. Allowing is the absence of interference. It is the removal of unnecessary tension that blocks natural organization. When control relaxes, intelligence that was already present becomes visible. Consider how complex systems operate. Order does not emerge because every detail is micromanaged. It emerges because the system is allowed to self-organize. Interfere too much, and coherence collapses. Step back enough, and patterns align without instruction. Reality functions the same way. It does not require supervision. It requires clarity. Effort repels outcomes not because action is wrong, but because strained action collapses flexibility. The more rigid the approach, the fewer pathways remain available. Allowing restores flow by reopening those pathways. It lets outcomes arrive through routes that control could never predict, because prediction itself is part of the limitation. This is also why timing feels mysterious under effort. Control tries to impose sequence. It wants guarantees. It demands linear progress. Allowing does not manage sequence. It recognizes that sequence is already handled. When interference stops, timing reasserts itself naturally. None of this requires withdrawal from life. Action still happens. Decisions are still made. Movement continues. What changes is the internal posture behind movement. Instead of bracing against reality, action moves with it. Instead of trying to dominate the field, action cooperates with it. This subchapter does not instruct you to stop doing anything. It clarifies why doing from tension fails. Control is not power. It is compensation for perceived lack. Allowing is not weakness. It is alignment with a larger order that does not need to be forced. Once this is seen, effort loses its authority. Not because effort is condemned, but because it is no longer necessary. And when effort dissolves, flow does not need to be created. It reveals itself as what was always carrying you forward. Contrast has been misunderstood for a long time. It has been framed as punishment, as failure, or as evidence that something has gone wrong. Yet contrast is not an error in the system. It is the system communicating. It is intelligence expressing itself through difference, tension, and polarity so that clarity can emerge. Without contrast, nothing could be recognized. Direction would be impossible. Identity would remain vague and unrefined. Just as the eye needs light and shadow to perceive form, awareness needs contrast to discern alignment. Expansion and contraction are not emotional accidents. They are signals. They indicate how closely your current orientation matches what is coherent for you. Expansion is the sensation of ease, openness, and clarity. It does not mean pleasure alone. It often feels like quiet rightness. Contraction, by contrast, feels tight, resistant, or heavy. It is not punishment. It is feedback indicating misalignment between what is being engaged and what is internally coherent. Neither state is moral. Both are informative. Contrast appears when an identity reaches the edge of its current definition. When you encounter friction, disappointment, or limitation, it is not because you are failing. It is because something in you is being refined. The experience reveals what no longer fits, what has become too small, or what was adopted unconsciously and no longer serves clarity. This is why contrast often intensifies before a shift. It is not escalating against you. It is sharpening perception. It forces attention onto what was previously vague. It clarifies preference, value, and direction. Not by telling you what to do, but by showing you what does not align. Expansion and contraction work together. Expansion confirms alignment. Contraction reveals discrepancy. When both are listened to without resistance, identity naturally recalibrates. Not through effort, but through recognition. You do not become something new by pushing away contrast. You refine what you are by understanding what contrast is revealing. This reframing dissolves unnecessary struggle. When contraction is interpreted as failure, it creates self-judgment and urgency. When it is recognized as guidance, it creates discernment. You stop fighting the signal and start reading it. The same experience that once felt obstructive becomes informative. Contrast does not exist to be eliminated. It exists to be integrated. Each point of tension clarifies the shape of coherence. Each moment of discomfort points toward a more accurate orientation. Not because you must chase comfort, but because coherence is naturally easeful when alignment is present. Notice how this removes blame from the process. Nothing has gone wrong when contraction appears. It simply means refinement is occurring. Identity is being updated. The system is self-correcting. Resistance arises only when contrast is misunderstood as something to overcome rather than something to understand. This subchapter does not ask you to prefer expansion or reject contraction. It asks you to see both as part of the same intelligence. One confirms direction. The other corrects it. Together, they guide without force, without judgment, and without effort. When contrast is no longer feared, it stops feeling like opposition. It becomes what it always was, the mechanism through which clarity sharpens itself. The movement now shifts from understanding into embodiment. What has been clarified conceptually must be felt directly, not as an idea to hold, but as a lived orientation. This is where recognition stops being something you think about and becomes something you stand within. And the first thing that must be seen clearly here is this: creation does not happen across time. It happens now, or it does not happen at all. The present moment is not a slice of time between past and future. It is the only point where anything is ever experienced, decided, or revealed. The past exists only as memory appearing now. The future exists only as anticipation appearing now. Outside of this immediate presence, nothing can be touched, influenced, or known. This is not a limitation. It is the mechanism. Creation requires presence because presence is where awareness meets experience. Without presence, there is only abstraction. Thinking about change is not creation. Planning for transformation is not creation. Rehearsing the past or projecting the future are movements within thought, not moments where reality reorganizes itself. Recognition collapses these movements back into the immediacy where something can actually occur. When recognition stabilizes, the past loosens its grip. Not because history is denied, but because its authority fades. Old interpretations lose urgency. Old identities stop demanding continuity. What you thought you were carrying forward reveals itself as a pattern that no longer needs to be maintained. The past does not disappear. It dissolves as a reference point for who you must be now. The future dissolves in a similar way. Anticipation softens. Anxiety about outcomes loses momentum. Not because nothing matters, but because meaning no longer depends on projection. When awareness rests fully here, the compulsion to secure tomorrow weakens. The future stops pulling attention out of the present, and in doing so, it loses its power to dictate behavior. This is why recognition is always immediate. It cannot be postponed. You cannot recognize later. You can only recognize now. Every attempt to delay understanding places it back into time and turns it into an object to be reached. Recognition ends time-bound seeking by revealing that what was being sought was never ahead. Creation happens now because now is where alignment can be felt. Clarity is immediate or it is imagined. Coherence is sensed directly or it is theorized. When awareness is present, action arises naturally, without rehearsal. Decisions do not need to be forced. They emerge from clarity rather than calculation. This does not mean life becomes static. Movement continues. Change continues. What changes is the reference point. Instead of dragging the past forward or chasing the future ahead, experience unfolds from immediacy. Each moment is complete enough to inform the next without needing to be controlled. This subchapter does not ask you to stay in the present as a discipline. It reveals that you have never left it. Only attention wandered. And when attention returns, creation is no longer something you try to make happen. It is something you notice is already occurring, here, without delay. From this ground, the next understanding becomes possible. If creation only happens now, then what determines the quality of what unfolds is not time, but who you recognize yourself to be within it. What unfolds in your life is not selected by effort, strategy, or persistence. It is selected by identity. Not the identity you describe verbally, but the identity you inhabit silently. The one that operates beneath intention. The one that does not announce itself, but determines what feels natural, possible, or inevitable. Identity is not a label. It is a state of being. It is the position from which perception operates. And from that position, certain experiences align effortlessly while others never even appear as options. This is not because reality is withholding anything. It is because reality organizes itself around coherence. What matches the current identity comes into view. What does not remains inaccessible, not by force, but by incompatibility. Vibration, in this context, is not something you generate. It is something you express by default. It is the signature of your identity in motion. When identity shifts, vibration shifts automatically. And when vibration shifts, the range of experiences you can encounter reorganizes without effort. You do not chase different outcomes. Different outcomes recognize you. This is why attempting to change circumstances without addressing identity feels exhausting. You are trying to override coherence with will. The system resists not because it is hostile, but because it is consistent. It reflects who you are being, not who you are trying to become. The moment identity changes, resistance disappears, because alignment is restored. Reality reorganizes subtly but decisively around self-concept. Conversations change tone. Opportunities appear without announcement. Decisions feel obvious instead of conflicted. You are not pushing into a new life. You are stepping into a version of experience that was already compatible with the identity now in place. This selection is not dramatic. It does not arrive with fireworks. It often feels anticlimactic because it is natural. Like gravity adjusting when weight shifts, the system recalibrates without commentary. What once felt distant becomes normal. What once felt impossible becomes mundane. Not because it was earned, but because it now fits. This also explains why effortful change rarely lasts. If identity remains unchanged, reality eventually snaps back into familiar patterns. The environment reflects the deeper orientation, not the temporary behavior layered on top. Sustainable transformation is not about maintaining effort. It is about stabilizing identity. Notice how this removes urgency. You do not need to rush into a better version of life. You do not need to force belief or maintain constant focus. Identity shifts through recognition, not pressure. When you see yourself differently, you relate to everything differently. And reality, in turn, responds accordingly. This subchapter does not instruct you to choose a new identity deliberately. That would still be effort. It clarifies the mechanism so that when recognition occurs, you understand why the world begins to look different without struggle. Identity is the selector. Vibration is its expression. Experience is the reflection. The next step is not to manipulate identity, but to understand what allows identity to shift instantly and permanently. That understanding does not come from trying. It comes from recognition. Delay has never been created by reality. It has been created by misunderstanding the mechanism. When change feels slow, blocked, or distant, it is not because something must be earned or perfected first. It is because recognition has not yet occurred at the level where identity reorganizes itself. Effort tries to bridge distance. Recognition reveals there was never any distance to cross. Recognition is not positive thinking. It is not belief. It is not repetition. It is the moment awareness sees something as already true rather than potentially attainable. And when that happens, the system updates instantly. There is no waiting period because nothing is being constructed. Something is being noticed. This is why calm receptivity is powerful in a way effort can never be. Effort implies lack. It signals that something is missing and must be supplied through action. Recognition implies presence. It acknowledges what is already the case. Reality responds differently to these two orientations because they are fundamentally different signals. When recognition occurs, tension drops out of the system. The need to monitor progress disappears. The urge to prove, defend, or sustain an outcome relaxes. This is not passivity. It is precision. It allows reality to reorganize without interference from urgency or doubt. Think of how understanding works in ordinary life. When you finally understand something clearly, you do not need to keep convincing yourself. You do not rehearse it. You simply know. The understanding becomes the new baseline from which everything else is interpreted. Recognition operates the same way, but at the level of identity rather than information. This is why recognition collapses delay. Delay only exists when the system is oriented toward becoming. Recognition shifts orientation to being. When being updates, experience follows immediately. Not always dramatically, but decisively. The waiting dissolves because there is nothing left to wait for. Calm is not a mood here. It is an indicator. It signals that recognition has landed deeply enough to remove friction. When calm appears naturally, without suppression, it is evidence that alignment has stabilized. The system is no longer bracing for change. It is allowing change to express itself. This does not mean that life suddenly becomes effortless in appearance. Movement still occurs. Challenges still arise. What changes is the internal reference point. You are no longer acting to become something else. You are responding from what has already been recognized as true. Action becomes clean. Decisions simplify. Timing stops feeling adversarial. Recognition also cannot be forced. You cannot recognize by trying to recognize. That only recreates effort in subtler form. Recognition arrives when attention is honest and open enough to see what is already present. This is why stillness, simplicity, and receptivity have always been emphasized by those who understood the mechanism intuitively. Nothing needs to be added for recognition to occur. Nothing needs to be removed either. The only requirement is seeing clearly. And when clarity appears, it does not announce itself loudly. It feels ordinary. Almost too simple. That is how you know it is real. This subchapter completes the movement from effort to alignment. What remains is not another step, but a final integration. If recognition is the mechanism, then the last question is no longer how reality works, but who you are when recognition stabilizes fully. This is the final integration. Everything up to this point has been loosening assumptions, clarifying structure, and dissolving effort. Now what remains is not something new to understand, but something old to release. The sense of being a partial self, a fragment moving through a larger whole, has reached its limit. It can no longer survive clear recognition. The feeling of being a fragment was never an experience. It was an interpretation. A mental outline drawn around sensation and thought, mistaken for a boundary. You learn to say, this is me, and, that is not, and over time that distinction hardened into identity. But nothing in direct experience ever confirmed it. It was inferred, repeated, and defended, but never actually found. You were never a piece broken off from something larger. You were never a wave separated from the ocean, trying to return. You were always the ocean appearing as a wave. The wave does not need to dissolve to become the ocean. It already is the ocean, temporarily shaped. Ego dissolution is not destruction. It is the end of misidentification. A field does not fragment when it expresses itself locally. A current does not lose its nature when it flows through a channel. In the same way, consciousness does not divide itself when it appears as individual perspective. Localization is not separation. It is focus. The belief that focus equals fragmentation is the only thing that ever created the sense of being incomplete. When this is seen clearly, the struggle to become whole dissolves. There is nothing to reintegrate. There is nothing to fix. The identity that felt partial was never accurate enough to require repair. It was simply an outline drawn by thought, mistaken for substance. Ego dissolution is often dramatized as something violent or overwhelming. In truth, it is quiet. Almost anticlimactic. It feels like relief. Like putting down a weight you did not know you were carrying. The need to define yourself tightly relaxes. The compulsion to defend an image softens. You do not disappear. What disappears is the belief that you were ever separate enough to need protection. This does not erase individuality. The wave still moves. The pattern still expresses. Preferences, creativity, and perspective remain. What dissolves is the sense that the pattern is isolated. You are no longer trying to maintain yourself against reality. You are allowing expression within it. Notice how this restores dignity without inflating importance. You are not elevated above anything. You are included in everything. The same field that animates stars, thoughts, breath, and silence is what you are, appearing here, this way. Nothing special needs to be claimed. Nothing needs to be denied. This is why the search ends naturally here. Not because you have arrived somewhere, but because the one who was trying to arrive is seen as unnecessary. The fragment dissolves because it was never real. And what remains is not emptiness, but fullness without division. From here, life is not about becoming whole. It is about living as what was never divided in the first place. Living as the field in human form does not require retreat from the world. It does not demand isolation, withdrawal, or a rejection of ordinary life. In fact, the opposite is true. This recognition only becomes real when it is lived, quietly and consistently, in the middle of relationships, responsibilities, choices, and movement. When the sense of being a fragment dissolves, action does not stop. It becomes cleaner. Decisions no longer come from anxiety about outcomes or fear of missteps. They arise from clarity. You notice that you are less reactive, not because you are suppressing emotion, but because there is less internal friction driving behavior. Action happens without the extra layer of self-monitoring that once drained energy. In relationships, this shift is immediately apparent. You are no longer trying to extract validation, safety, or completion from others. Listening deepens because there is less need to defend an image. Boundaries become clearer, not harsher. You can say yes without overcommitting and no without guilt. Connection feels simpler, more direct, because it is no longer burdened by hidden agendas. Conflict changes as well. When tension arises, it is addressed rather than dramatized. You are less invested in being right and more interested in resolution. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You respond instead of react. You engage without escalation. You recognize that clarity does not require domination. In daily decisions, living as the field looks unremarkable from the outside. You still choose where to go, what to work on, how to spend your time. What changes is the internal reference point. Choices are no longer attempts to secure identity. They are expressions of it. You are not trying to become someone through action. You are allowing action to express who you already are. Work becomes an arena for embodiment rather than struggle. Effort is applied where it is natural and released where it is unnecessary. You do not force productivity. You allow focus. You do not chase meaning. You notice where engagement feels coherent and move in that direction. Results emerge without the constant pressure to prove worth. Even rest changes quality. It is no longer collapse after effort. It is restoration without guilt. You are not resting to recover from being wrong. You are resting because rhythm is natural. Movement and stillness balance themselves without command. Living this way does not make life perfect. Challenges still appear. Complexity still exists. What disappears is the sense that life is happening against you or that you must constantly manage yourself to survive it. You meet circumstances as they are, not as threats to identity. There is no special posture to maintain. No state to hold on to. When misalignment appears, it is noticed and corrected naturally, without self-criticism. You return to clarity the same way you return to balance while walking. Without drama. This is embodiment. Not mystical, not abstract, not removed from life. Just life lived without the unnecessary weight of separation. The field does not need to be expressed loudly. It expresses itself through simplicity, coherence, and presence, wherever you are, as you are. What has been unfolding through this entire transmission reaches completion here, not as a conclusion, but as a settling. Nothing new needs to be added. Nothing needs to be achieved. The arc closes because it was never meant to stretch endlessly forward. It was meant to return awareness to itself, gently and irrevocably. The field has always been recognizing itself. Through every experience, every question, every moment of seeking and release, recognition has been occurring quietly. What changes now is not the field, but stability. Identity no longer oscillates between expansion and contraction. It no longer wonders whether it is separate or connected. The recognition becomes the ground rather than an experience that comes and goes. You are not a person who understands the field. You are the point at which the field is understanding itself. Not conceptually. Directly. Without commentary. This is not a role you take on. It is what remains when the effort to be anything else falls away. Awareness recognizes its own continuity through this perspective, and that recognition is enough. Nothing dramatic needs to follow from this. The stillness here is not emptiness. It is fullness without demand. Life continues to move, choices continue to arise, form continues to express. But the sense that something fundamental is missing no longer drives the movement. The quiet certainty underneath experience stabilizes, and with it, a different quality of presence emerges. This is how recognition serves the whole without intention. When the field recognizes itself at any point, that recognition is immediately available everywhere. Not because it is transmitted, but because there was never more than one field to begin with. No effort is required to contribute. Being aligned is contribution. Stability is service. Clarity radiates without direction. You do not need to teach this. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to convince anyone. The field does not awaken through argument. It awakens through recognition, and recognition spreads through coherence, not persuasion. Simply living from this understanding alters the space around you, subtly and inevitably. Notice the absence of urgency here. There is nothing left to rush toward. Nothing left to fix. Nothing left to resolve. The future no longer carries the weight of salvation. The past no longer carries the weight of explanation. What remains is a quiet readiness to meet whatever appears, as it appears, without resistance. This is not an ending in the usual sense. It is the end of searching. The end of distance. The end of the belief that truth was elsewhere. What continues is expression, exploration, and refinement, but without the tension of incompleteness. Remain here for a moment. Not doing anything. Not expecting anything. Just noticing the simplicity of being aware. This is the field, recognizing itself through you, exactly as it always has. Share this with someone who needs to hear it before their timeline closes, and subscribe so this recognition continues to stabilize.